Well, such a beautiful night. Thanks everyone for being here. Well, we want to start with how we started doing this work almost 9 years ago now in Medellin. And we arrived to Medellin with one question in mind, and it was, how is it, or what are the socioeconomic, sociopolitical dynamics that funnel youth into cycles of violence? How are these dynamics produced, reproduced? But what happened when we started to do field work and walk around the so-called peripheries of Medellin was that, guided by this question, the people that we started to meet at the moment, especially youth community leaders, would tend to talk less about the instances of violence and more about the peaceful responses to that violence. And since then we said, well, there is something here that perhaps we should look at. Let's shift the focus of the work and started then to concentrate on that, right? To concentrate on the peaceful responses to the violence. A good friend of us, his name is Augusto, once on top of Comuna 2 in Medellin, the oldest comuna, and I will explain what a comuna is. This is how Medellin is divided politically. There are 16 comunas, but generally in Colombia, people referred to the poorest or most impoverished places as comunas. And so we were walking in Comuna Nororiental, the northeastern one, with Augusto, and he was explaining the history of it. Actually, last year it was its 100th anniversary of that region of Medellin. And he said, well, you have heard a lot of stories of violence. ¿Pa cuándo nuestra historia? When are you going to tell our story? Those that actually have been working on peace building since the 70s. I already revealed his age. So that's that.
Very young. Yeah, so when we walked around, one of the things I know that, Joan is from Colombia, so he has more street credibility than I did there. I wanted to make sure I wasn't coming in as this gringa from, the Columbia University and telling people what to do. So that's the last thing I do, because I don't know what they should do. But as we discovered all of the wonderful methods, we kept thinking, how can we work with the people that we're meeting? How can we enhance what they're doing? And where is what we do not necessary there too? So that was part of our walks. And you always had to go to the comunas, which are extremely hilly, and everything was always a 4-hour walk. You could not do anything for less than 4 hours. So you'd be up and down the hills, and everybody wanted to tell you their story. And we really listened to the stories, trying to think about what is going on here. There's something more than the violence.
And to contextualize you, especially this comuna, the northeastern one, started to become populated before the 60s, but really, really populated during the 60s as indigenous Afro-Colombians and especially peasants people were being displaced as the war in Colombia started to escalate, a war that ended, at least officially, as most of you know, in 2016. And so during the 80s and 90s, there was a discourse constructed upon these places of the city of no future, especially talking about the youth. So it seemed, at least in the narrative, that youth who grew up in these places of the city would only have one option of life, which would be to join a militia connected to one of the guerrillas that were starting to arrive in the city of Medellin, like especially ELN, then FARC. And out of that narrative, a very important book for people of Medellin, but for people of Colombia, was published, and it was called No Nacimos Pa' Semilla. Literally, it translates into "We were not born to flourish," if you will. And the English translation, it's
Born to Die in Medellin.
It's Born to Die in Medellin. This was written by Alonso Salazar, former mayor of Medellin, a journalist very much engaged with understanding this sector of the city that was sort of non-existent for many in Colombia. And he concentrated in telling the stories of youth who would join gangs, militia groups in this same region. As we started to listen to the stories of people who also lived the 80s, the 90s in Medellin, but who were telling us other stories, we once told Salazar, why did you focus only on those stories, on those, the people that would join these groups? He said, well, that was what I saw. If there is another book to write, you do it. And I think that was the impetus.
So we did.
So that was the impetus for writing this book, which then extended beyond Medellin, and we'll talk more about that.
Yeah, so this picture here is a group called Casa Colacho, which is in Medellin, that we visited. And part of what we're doing here is they work with a lot of youth in their area in Comuna 13, Comuna 13, and they have a lot of after-school programs. So kids come and they learn the 4 different streams or the lines of hip-hop, which keeps them out of trouble and keeps them engaged, and they have a way to artistically express themselves as well. And so we really wanted to continue to document, which we're continuing to do. And I think part of our value added is that we can amplify these voices and we can help people be known and what they're doing be known around the world, and also to possibly influence other youth in other places. And
so again, this lack of attention to the spaces that are created in war zones. I mean, the northern comunas of Medellin were war zones for a lot of time. The lack of attention to the peaceful responses was very, very present there. And in one of the interviews we did in Quibdó, in the Pacific region of Colombia, to a collective of youth, Jóvenes Creadores del Chocó, Youth Creators of Chocó, a wonderful artistic collective. Catherine, the leader of that group, told us, one of the issues is that the violent ones have too many spokespeople, and we really don't have anyone that speaks on our behalf. So it's imperative that we enter almost into a struggle with those that only like to speak about the violence. And so we then started to ask ourselves, but how do we speak about this? How do we speak about peace? When violence is I don't know if easy, but it's easier to demonstrate the expressions of violence, of war, because it's noisy, it's spectacular. Peace is not, right? It's subtle, it's delicate. How do we speak about this? And so we said, well, why don't we tell the stories of those who have constructed spaces of peace in their communities? And from there, perhaps, we and those who read and get to know these stories will start to sense what peace might be.
And so we're always very conscious of making sure that however we told the stories was well representing what the people wanted to be represented, and that we were being respectful. When we talk about the subtleties of peace, sometimes people would just say that, what are we doing to help our kids get from home to school and then back again safely? That was peace building, how mothers came together to escort their kids back and forth to school.
And something that Catherine also told us in Quibdó was, if you are going to represent these stories, you have to represent them well.
No pressure.
And so how do we do this? And then, of course, in conversations, we were very much guided. I mean, the book was guided by the people that we interviewed, for the most part. And one was, do not romanticize our stories, because that happens a lot as well. That's one. Don't romanticize them, and don't own the story. Right? The peace processes take place here. We construct them. A lot of academics end up sort of owning that and claiming that they produced those technologies, those tools. So those two things were asked, I think, from us in terms of representation.
So we used a couple of different methods in our approach, and one is PAR, Participatory Action Research, and it really is about community involvement. So we really wanted to co-author with people to have their voices very representative. And it also takes a long time. It takes a long time to build trust. It takes a long time to really understand all the little nuances. You can't go in for a day or a week and think you understand it. It doesn't work, I think, that way. It took me 9 years to figure out what's going on there. And then narrative analysis, we're looking for how people talk about their existence, how they talk about peace, how they talk about their lives. And also, when we do any kind of intervention, how do we identify the ways in which their conversation changes? And we look for that. CMM is a method that we've been using, coordinated management of meaning, and it really is about how do people make meaning in their lives? How do they understand their situations, and how do they coordinate meaning making with other people? And one comment I'll make is that we've been teaching CMM to all the different people that we work with there, and they've used it and continue to use it with other people, so it just takes on a life of its own. Dynamical system is understanding systems, and people understand that. Why don't they just X? Why don't they just fix this? We say, well, if they did that, and then we're trying to look at the system and the understanding what happens when you push here and it pushes out there and the ripple effects, to be more mindful. I'll just do a really quick example of that. Once we were working with a group, and then there were some graffiti artists in the audience, and they said, well, it's easy. All we have to do is just paint and make the area beautiful. And then somebody said, yeah, that will bring more tourism. And people say, yeah, that's great, we get more money in the neighborhood. And they said, yeah, but then there's more sex tourism. And then there's different things happening. And then they started to understand, as one person built on the other person's ideas about what would happen, it's not that simple. You don't just go beautify and paint things. Then we also looked at ethnography and really understanding from within the system we're there, and we tried to stay there. And we have been working with some groups for the 9 years. So we just keep revisiting and building on that. And I will let you talk about Parche.
Yeah, Parchar is this method that we are developing with a group of very sophisticated peace builders in Comuna 13 in Medellin. And it's really a combination of methods. But the center of this Parchar in Medellin and in Colombia in general, it's almost to hang out. That would be, I guess, a decent translation. And what happens is that when you're hanging out, you get into deeper conversations. You get to connect more to the system, to the context in which you are. And so with this group that Beth alluded to, Casa Colacho, we are developing a methodology based very much on ethnography and these different components together. So we sort of baptized it as Parchar.
It may involve alcohol on occasion, and it may involve salsa dancing. I'm just putting that out there, right?
Very important.
Got to be with the people.
So that's Colombia, and you know, part of the issue with a country like Colombia, when we are trying to understand why has it been a country that has experienced such a long violent conflict. So some claim that it's 70 years, right, starting with the birth of guerrilla movements, especially FARC. Others claim that it's a conflict that really dates back to its independence. So 200 years of conflict. And there are a lot of violentologists in Colombia. We know very well how to understand the violence, but not the peace, right? The responses to it. And one element that is important to bear in mind here is that Colombia is a country of regions. Right? It's not a homogeneous country. So the Caribbean, which is Barranquilla, Cartagena, that region, it's very much different culturally, economically, linguistically from the Andes, for instance, where Bogota, Medellin is located here. And the Andes are very much different from Cali, from the Pacific region, or from Orinoquia, which is closer to the border with Venezuela, and indeed to all of the South. So it's a country of different regions that are drastically different, and thus the violent conflict has expressed itself differently in each region, given the characteristics, the geographical characteristics, and also the responses to that conflict have been different. And so what we said is, why don't we try to listen to stories that somehow, not completely, tell us the difference between these responses through region. And so we went, well, most of our work is in Medellin, but we did interviews, especially for the purpose of this book, in Morroa, in Montes de Maria, in the north, the Caribbean region, in Cartagena, in Quibdó, on the Pacific coast there, a region that it's especially inhabited by Afro-Colombian communities who have completely different understandings of territory, of space, of violence, of peace. We then went to Cali as well, and then to Pasto, which is in the most Andean region of Colombia. And the responses that we heard there and that you will read in the book are very powerful. So the idea of doing this was precisely to understand that it's important when we are learning about the development of a conflict and the development of peace processes to look at the geography, or else we miss completely the point.
Yeah, and some of it was also guided by where it was safe to go. So the bottom right-hand area was Amazon, and there's another area in the left-hand where it was a place called Cauca, where there was violence there, and we were advised not to go there. But some other places had violence a little bit beforehand. Well, nobody from risk management is here, right? So some other places that had violence before, but then it was safe for us to go at that time. So that governed where we were going to go and interview people.
And we were doing some of these interviews right before the past elections of 2020?
No, 22, 20.
Well,
when was the
elections.
president elected in Colombia? 21, 20?
Yeah,
22.
which were very, very loaded. And we actually, when we were in the coast, in the Caribbean coast, there was an armed strike by a paramilitary, by Clan del Golfo. Right? So all of this, you don't understand this if you don't go to the field and actually work from there.
Yeah, and also the inconvenience of some of the places. I mean, Quibdó was so hot, just in the jungle, and then was it Pasto where we had that on top of the mountain? There was like a landing strip, very, very tiny, and if you miss it, I don't know what would happen if you miss it, but very, very good pilots. And then one place we went, it was like a 4-hour drive. It was the only way to get there.
So it's a very complex territory to be sure.
It was rich and exhausting at the same time. So piece at the community level, one of the things we loved about, this was in Cali, right? Yeah. One of the things we loved about this particular woman and what she was doing is that she was part of the displaced people from the Pacific coast. And what she did with all the kids in the area through music was she was giving them a sense of their cultural origins through song and dance. And when that little kid, one kid would just sort of hit the drum, then suddenly all the kids would come together there.
And so there are two, if you will, findings of the book, or we named at least two different categories of peace building. One is that there are ecologies of peace building, so those social practices, including language, those technologies that communities put together to respond peacefully to the conflict, right, that flourish in specific geographies. So we divided this in two categories: the geographies of peace building, so those areas in which peace building practices take place and where the people who inhabit those areas are positively affected by those peace building initiatives, and then the ecologies, right? Those tools, those practices, etc. And some of the examples of the ecologies, right? Those things that flourish there are convites. Convites it's a practice that dates to the 50s at least from what we have heard, and it's just a family arrives to a marginalized community in Cali or especially in Medellin. This word is used, and they're displaced. They arrive with their family, and the whole community puts together a soup, a community soup, brings a box of beer, and together they help this newly arrived family build a home. Or if, let's say, we need money to send one of the kids who is really good at playing football to a tournament. They say, let's do a convite, let's do a soup, let's gather some cash, etc. Right? So it's these gatherings. That's how they call it. That's a convite. There are mingas. This happens mostly in the south of Colombia, Cauca and Nariño, very much connected with indigenous communities. And these are also these kind of gatherings that put together resources to resolve a daily issue, something that is pressing in the community. And then there are languages. Since we started going to Medellin to do this field work, we would listen to the youth saying, we are part of la resistencia, we are part of this resistance. So we would ask, what is this? So there are linguistic configurations that we make a deal in our writing to understand better these geographies.
And the community building was so important because, just to give you a little context, before Syria and the war and conflict in Syria, Colombia had the highest number of internally displaced persons in the country. So I think more than 6 million people were internally displaced, and they would come together on the fringes of different cities and locations. And so the soup, the sancocho, or other kinds of ways of coming together was a way of integrating them into their neighborhood. So we also were paying attention to not only the peace building that we call grassroots peace building and that different groups made, but we wanted to understand what's the connection between the local peace building efforts and policy. And this happens also at the high level, like the Havana peace talks, and then other things in the Constitution.
The history of Colombia, it's also a history of peace processes. There have been, every 30 years, there is a peace process. And they sometimes have been well done, like the last one, for example, between the government and FARC. But many have left out many of the armed actors, political actors, social actors. And that's one of the reasons why the conflict, one of the reasons, among many others, the conflict continues to recycle. Right? So we, in one of the chapters, go through the history of peace processes in Colombia. One can tell the story of Colombia through its peace processes. Colombia is a very, very legalistic country, so on the paper, if one reads the Constitution, the last one of '91, it's like a utopia, it's beautiful. Right? And this tendency of Colombians to rely specifically on text and on the legal aspects have then made it very hard for what happens on the ground to have a real effect. And the Constitution of '91 was the result of the convergence, if you will, after a peace process between a guerrilla group, the M19. Actually, the current president of Colombia was part of that guerrilla group. The Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, so it was a plural constitution. And one of the articles has as a mandate to the governing seat the mandate of peace, of establishing, defending, and keeping peace as a right. There is the Victims Law that passed in 2011 that deals with the objective of the law is to deal with the effects, the negative effects of especially forcibly displaced people. This has had its issues because, of course, that there is the subjectivity aspect in which you start identifying as a victim to gain specific benefits or not, very problematic. But it's at the policy level, it has worked somehow. Then Law 70, which deals with Afro-Colombian communities, discomfort pieces of land, specifically on the Pacific coast, and they were given back to the Afro-Colombian communities for them to start creating their territories, and it has worked somehow well. And lastly, it's this peace process that took place between the Santos government and FARC, which successfully ended in 2016 with two very important elements. One, it's a special judicial system, a transitional justice system that centers the victims. And the other one, it's a truth commission. It's the second one in Colombia, well, this one is the first official one, and so this is sort of some of the elements that we were able to see in policy.
So those two, the Transitional Justice and the Truth Commission, are very important because they bridge the high-level Track 1 policy agreement from the Havana Peace Talks with the local grassroots initiatives, because they're there. So in the Truth Commission, they went all over the country, they interviewed lots of people, they made recommendations, and now it is the local grassroots organizations that have to implement those changes. And when it comes to land property, we met a wonderful woman who was here for a while. She was an Obama scholar in the first cohort of Obama scholars. And she has an organization called FEM, F-E-M, in Cartagena area. And what they did was they got together and tried to figure out how to make it possible for people to get the deeds to their land. Because as we know in conflicts around the world, and especially in Colombia too, people, land would change hands. How do you claim it if you don't have the paper that shows that you own that land? So they figured out that they're going to focus on women because they couldn't take care of the whole country. And they also figured out there was a 17-step process because they were also limited in their own resources. So they would teach these women the 17 steps and they would guide them along, but the women would take the initiative. And even if it took years, which it does, then it would still happen. And they've been proven successful in what they were doing. So we thought that was a pretty inspirational story too. And some other guiding concepts here.
Well, one of the testimonies. So these guiding concepts, we grabbed them on the field, right? We didn't take them with us from here and apply them, but actually in a dialectical form, we were able to specify some things, and one has to do with territory. So there is one peasant in Morroa, in Montes de Maria, said there's one thing to have land and a very different thing to have territory. And this really intrigued us. And then we heard the same story in Quibdó by Catherine, the leader of Jóvenes Creadores del Chocó, who told us the territory for us is everything. That's all we have. And so we paid a lot of attention to that, to what territory means in Colombia in its relation to the conflict, especially because, as Beth was saying, Colombia has suffered mass displacement. So we had to take territory as a very important concept here. And what we saw is that it's both a physical space indeed, so you need land, but it's also a conceptual, epistemological space where you can practice those things that are important for you, for your community. And sometimes the policy is not able to sort of get to that level of understanding territory at that stage.
And then the cultural and artistic organizations that it's one of the most beautiful countries in terms of the graffiti and the murals that are there. And the whole process of how this happens is not just what they would call like bombing, where they just put things up, but there's an actual methodology. And so a lot of the graffiti artists that we knew, or we know, are teaching younger people how to express themselves through graffiti and all of the different disciplines that it takes, how to hold a can of spray, and then there's a certain graduation that they go through. And that it really is a way of displaying the culture and people coming together, and it sort of goes hand in hand with, I think, Colombia being a very musical country. We can stand on a corner of an intersection someplace in Medellin, and on four corners, there are stereos blasting salsa music, but all different kinds of music. So if you just stand in the middle, it's like, but it can be overwhelming, but it can be also very enriching.
And going back to the initial question, that it's really the guiding question of all of this, it's, why is it that we don't know much about the peaceful responses to the conflict, has to do with the invisibility of those who experience the war, right? So most people in Bogotá wouldn't be able to tell you, well, I suffered a bomb, or in Medellin even, or in Cali. It's mostly peasants, Afro-Colombians, on the, if you will, peripheries of the country, the ones who have experienced the harshest effects of war, and these communities are completely invisible in the national narrative. And so because in these geographies, and that's why it's important to understand this concept of the geographies of peace building, because these geographies are isolated, silenced, and it's in these geographies where peace building practices take place that does the invisibility of them.
It also answers another question we often ask is, well, if everything's so bad, why aren't things worse? And it's not worse in that people are able to survive and sometimes thrive because of these peace-building processes. And another interesting comment was about denormalizing violence. You know, to this day, if I say to people that I'm going to Colombia, they say, is it safe? Can you go there? And I go, like, yes. I wouldn't just go by myself in all the different areas because I don't know, just like I wouldn't go anywhere in New York, like certain areas by myself either. So you have to get to know it, but it's changing the narrative. And we think that by promoting and amplifying the voice of the peace builders in the country, that we're helping to change that narrative.
We last summer, which feels as if it was 10 years ago.
A long time ago.
We traveled, we did a course, a fieldwork course, and went with some students from here, from the university to Bogota and to Medellin. And we had a reunion with one commander of a guerrilla group and one commander of a paramilitary group. We had a panel there. And one of them said that Colombians are violent, that we are a violent country. And that was very hard to hear, coming especially from someone who has been violent. And what we thought is that this is not necessarily true. It's just that the violence has had way more coverage on news, on literature, pop culture, etc. But the majority of Colombians do not like to engage in conflict. And that's, I think, something that we have been able to notice. And when you read the literature, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, where we are situated, Colombia is conceived as a violent place. But it has to do with narrative. And thus, the work, especially of Beth, with CMM has been so primordial because it's the narrative analysis aspect, the stories, what's the issue there that we haven't paid attention to.
And I think another part of the narrative is that when people don't know alternatives, then they do what they know. And if you know violence because you grew up in violent areas and you don't see alternatives, then that's what you resort to. But we and other youth leaders are helping to change that dynamic as well. So now we met this very enterprising young man named Joel, and it was just by chance. We almost left and somebody said, no, you really have to go see Joel. So we went to the beach and we saw Joel, and Joel and his group have this phenomenal setup where it is a self-contained system because they have really social entrepreneurship in addition to everything else they're doing, which is a big issue for a lot of youth leaders when they don't have the resources to sustain the work that they're doing.
Well, and I guess our hopes, this is the way for us to close and then open it up for a conversation, which is the most important and interesting part. It's that that we understand, or what we want to get with the book is that we shift a little bit our gaze. Where do we look at? And to try to uncover those silences in history. There are things happening, and this is not only particular to violent zones. That happens in places like New York. There are things happening that are just simply not seen, and I think the book hopes that we sort of that our invitation is taken to look at those things that take place at the silences, at the dark, at the shadows of history.
We will open it up to questions. I think Isadora is going to be handling that part of the program.
Thank you so much, Beth and Joan, for your inspiring book and for this thoughtful presentation. And hearing you speak tonight brought back so many good memories from our trip last year. And for context, I'm Isadora Caldas. I'm an alumna from Colombia's Negotiation and Conflict Resolution program. And last year, I had the privilege to travel with Beth and Joan and a group of students to Colombia as part of the course on practicum and peace building. And there we had the chance to hear from the source some of the stories that they're telling in their book. So I'll open up for questions, but I'll give you some minutes to think about and elaborate, and I'll go ahead and ask the first one. So you make it clear in your book that it is about the local stories and not about your experience as observers, but I wanted to ask you a question about your experience as observers, which is you have been going to Colombia for over 8 years for this work, coming in and stepping out, coming back to New York, And I wanted to hear more about this process and what were the benefits and some challenges of stepping in and stepping out.
So stepping in and stepping out. So stepping in is, you have to then re-immerse yourself in the context and let go of where you came from. The advantage of working with some people, so we have new people all the time, but some constant is that you get to see the progression of your work with them. And I mean, some of the people we work with were barely 20 at the beginning, right? And now they're like almost 30. They've aged, but we haven't. It's really amazing how that happens. So just watching that progression is really fabulous. And I think that when you step out and step back in, you're able to come in with fresh eyes. If you're there all the time and just working inside of a situation, you don't get a chance to see some of the change. And I'll give one example with Wilmore. So through CMM, which for over a 2-year period, he was using this kind of communication technique with a group of people. And the group of people, they were talking about what does reconciliation mean to you? And he was taking them through a process, and they were capturing their stories, and they came up with a couple of different themes about what reconciliation means. And then he had access to a whole group of graffiti artists. He brought the graffiti artists with the community, and they were talking about the different ideas that the community had about reconciliation. And then the graffiti artists went and created this visual representation of reconciliation, which is this tremendous big mural that's outside the Museum of Memory in Medellin. So this was going on. It was a 2-year process that we didn't know anything about. And Wilmar, who we've known since the beginning, said, I really want to show you something. So we said, okay. So we went, and it was really like so overwhelming and breathtaking, very emotional, because suddenly there was this beautiful, phenomenal mural, and he told us the process. So stepping out and stepping back in helped me to see that if I was watching the process all along the way, it may not have been as exciting.
All right, thank you so much. Joan, do you want to add anything? Or?
Yeah, and for me it's also interesting because I'm from Colombia. But being able to leave the country gives me a privileged angle to look at things. And I remember this character of one of Borges' stories that says that the truthiness of the origin of the Quran is in the fact that it doesn't mention camels. So sometimes when you're so close to something, you don't see. So when you're able to take a step back, and being here, studying here, has allowed me, I think, to look at things from a privileged angle and to point at things from that angle. But there's also problems associated with leaving, right? You're not there and you miss a lot of things as well.
Yeah, so you have to make sure that if you start an initiative that you have good partners on the ground to continue that initiative, because otherwise you're restarting every time, and that we've been through that, and that doesn't always work well.
All right, thank you for sharing your experience. And now we will start with the audience questions. I'll ask you to raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll walk over to you with the microphone.
First of all, thank you so much for holding this event. I really appreciate it. I am Colombian as well. Nice to meet you. I just want to say, how can I address to you, Professor Lopez or Juan C?
Joan.
Okay, listo. So, my name is Natalia Velasquez, and I just want to say I'm very proud of the situation right now. I've been in this country for 20 years, and I always look for anyone that evolves in any one cultural situation. It doesn't matter that is Hispanic or European or anything, but I am very proud of that. So I just want to put that in front. Second of all, thank you so much. And my question is, I know there are a lot of factors that brought you to do this book. And I just want, if you can highlight what are the main factors that, inspire you to write this book. What are the main factors? And I know there's a lot, but if you can just highlight one, that would be great. Thank you.
Well, I think the question at the beginning of the presentation, when Augusto told us when are you going to write our story? The story of those peace builders.
Yeah, so because we saw so many good things happening, and we knew that when we looked at the literature that existed, it didn't highlight those stories. So we wanted to be able to capture that and draw attention to the other side of the story, not only the conflict that was happening.
Hi, thank you so much for this space. My name is Cindy Clares. I'm an independent video journalist. I also grew up in Colombia, and one of the things that I battle a lot with pushing for stories and trying to get coverage is that a lot of times things are pegged to something that happened, and there's something so beautiful about the daily work of these organizations that are not necessarily pegged to an event. And so I'd love to there was something that really touched me when you said about romanticizing stories, but also having systems in place where you're being respectful of the efforts and sort of like staying consistent with the narratives of the stories. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how can we do that? How can we sort of respectfully give that space and those efforts, the humanity that they deserve when it comes to storytelling?
So I think part of it is how do we find out about different people too is part of that question as well. And we just do a lot of word of mouth. And so somebody said, oh, you really should talk to this person, really should talk to that person. So the more you get to know people, then the more those things are set up. So I think in advance, we had appointments or interviews with different people, but then other situations and other people and organizations emerged, as the case with Joel we talked about there. And then, in our conversation, we also would talk to people about how do you want this to be known? What are the things you want people to know about the work that you're doing? So we're capturing it from them as well. And what was the name of the organization? Casa de Paz, the one in Bogota when we were talking about. Yeah, so these are people like women who were former FARC soldiers, and they had some money from the government afterwards, and so they started this place of peace, right, together. And so how did we tell their story? And when they tell you their story, then they're also telling you how they want their story to be told. So we try to be respectful of that, for example.
It's a very difficult thing to do, right? Because what can happen is that you end up romanticizing, the harsh conditions of people. I think one way it's to first put names to those faces, to right? When the news, for instance, academic work in general, likes to put numbers, 30 were assassinated, or numbers, statistics, etc. They help us, but I think one way of telling stories is actually putting the name on those who experience issues of violence, and telling the stories as much as possible from their own perspective. I think that question that you just mentioned, Beth, of how would you like your story to be told, it's very important there. But it's very difficult. It's something that I think we battle with ourselves.
Yeah, so I think one part about not romanticizing it is that some people did perpetrate violence. We're not necessarily blaming them, but we're also trying to understand the context about what created that situation. So it really, goes on in a lot of deep conversations. And I have to say, over the years, it was really hard at the beginning to hear so many stories, because everybody wants to tell you their story. And after a while, I was like, I can't hear another story. I just can't hear another story. And sometimes Joan has a lot more patience than I do, and I'd be like, and he'd be like, because you just get saturated and you feel so hopeless. And people really, they tell you, because I don't know, I feel like they want me to save them. And I'm like, I can't save you, in that situation. So that's very challenging. And then we also have had many conversations about the ethical aspects of what we're doing, making sure that people want to be involved in the work that we're doing, and making sure they want their name to be known. So that's always very much on our minds as well.
And another, like another layer of this, especially for this work, is that it's written in a language that is not, it's not Spanish. So that adds another problem of interpretation. What we try to do is to show almost what we are going to write and how are we going to tell it, and almost get it approved by those who are very generous and share their stories. But there is no key to doing this, right? It's an ongoing process. We talk about it as a craft. You're always moving forward, but there is no key for that.
I think another part, I was just going to talk about like Andy's role and Juanita's role and so on. So we had people who were from Colombia traveling with us as well, and they would participate in the conversations, and they would bring their own experiences into it, and so that I think would help facilitate the conversation as well when they were involved in it.
First, thank you for thinking of peace first. Second, peace is a very elusive word. Most of the warriors, wherever you find them, usually understand themselves as looking for peace. So the guerrilla think that they were looking for peace because Colombia was violent, and the paramilitaries were trying to make the country peaceful. And then when the Spaniards took Colombia against independence, General Murillo was the pacificador. Everyone looking for peace, so it's too elusive. But I want to just mention two things of your extremely interesting work. One is the term parchar. Parchar comes from parche. Parche means patch. Okay? So the guy that is your body is your parche. You are together, like with a patch. So it means solidarity. So the promotion of solidarity and the existence of solidarity is what allows Colombia to survive. Based on what the Truth Commission said, 450,000 people were killed during this last process of violence. 450,000 is 1% of the population, just murder. So thanks to solidarity, Colombia survives. And it brings me to the other point, is the category that you mentioned of territory. That's very misleading because of the other event that you underlined, that you put in a very relevant place, which is displacement. Colombia is a land of displacement. People that live in certain areas, they may consider that area their territory. But actually, that's just a refugee camp. They were displaced from another area. People live in the jungle. Let's say after the Colombian government decided to stop the land reform process in the 80s, they promoted what they call the expansion of the agricultural frontier. So many people went to the jungle, and the FARC went with them to be like the local police. So those places that they have in the Amazons, in Caquetá, in many places, that's not their territory. They are foreigners there. They are living in a hostile and unknown land. Okay? So there are people, like let's say communities in the Pacific area, these Afro-American, these Afro-Colombian people, they consider their territory. They actually have been living there for several centuries. But many people living in Chocó are absolutely in foreign territory. So just two things, because the idea of territory ends up in a very problematic policy, which is sending back the people to their so-called territory. So it's to send them back to lands with no protection, with the presence of the same violent actors, but they present that as going back to your territory. What actually they are doing is displacing them again. So just those 2 points, and thank you for helping us to build peace.
Thank you.
I have a question. From your point of view, where you see Colombia in 20 years when it comes to peace?
In 20 years, if some of the recommendations that came out of the Truth Commission and Transitional Justice HEP, if those can be implemented, then I think there will be an advancement and a more secure peace. One of the challenges, I think, in Colombia is that every 4 years there's a different person serving a term. So you can't have 2 consecutive terms of political office. And in some ways it's good, because if you don't like the person in office, you want to make sure they change. But there's also a lack of continuity. So something starts and then it stops, and then something starts and then it stops. So I think that's why we need to think about those other organizations that can see things through across administrations. But anything can happen. It depends on economics. It depends on what happens and how people respond to that. I think that's a really big driver, and one of the drivers of the conflict to begin with, or economics, and then outside influence, from other countries.
And so before I address that, I want to address your comment about territory. So indeed, there is displacement, and going back to the territory signifies further displacement. But that's why it's important to listen to the peasants. And some of them say that one thing is to have land, physical land, and a different one is to have territory. So that's a different sort of understanding of how you inhabit a place. And then about the 20 years, it's, the problem also is that Colombia is not isolated from the world, and as conflicts escalate in other regions of the world, that has an effect as well on local politics in Colombia, as well as in local economics in Colombia. So it's hard to predict, and luckily we are not sociologists who predict, so we can't answer that.
Back
Thank
to
you,
for
everybody.
final.
Thank you, everyone.